real stories of werewolves of Dogman history from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Dogman Vs Me, the Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I stood there deep in the woods, staring at a creature that I couldn't believe existed. Not quite wolf, not quite dog. It was the head that haunts my dreams to this day. This was something primeval that seemed to embody the essence of canine predation, distilled into its most terrifying form. The snout extended a good 8 inches from its face, lined with fangs that gleamed wet in the moonlight. Its upper fangs protruded slightly over its lower jaw, giving it a perpetual snarl. The ears stood upright and alert, swiveling independently like radar dishes tracking every sound. It was a dogman, and soon it would be battling a werewolf. But before I get to that story, let me give you some backstory. What drives a man to walk away from everything? That's a question I've been asked more times than I can count over the past 5 decades. It wasn't depression or running from the law that pushed me into the Pennsylvania wilderness in the summer of 1973. It was something far more elusive, a hunger for meaning that seemed impossible to satisfy in the neon-lit reality of post-Vietnam America. I was 24, disillusioned, and adrift in a sea of counter-cultural idealism that was already beginning to fade. The revolution we'd all been promised was in the process of fizzling into disco and designer drugs. My construction job paid the bills but hollowed me out a little more each day. My girlfriend had recently left for a commune in Oregon, taking our cat and my favorite Grateful Dead records. The timing seemed perfect for dramatic reinvention. The term Vision Quest first floated into my consciousness at some forgotten house party in Pittsburgh. A bearded guy in wired-rimmed glasses was holding court about indigenous spirituality with the fervent conviction of someone who'd read exactly one book on the subject. The shamans would send young men into the wilderness alone, he explained between sips of homemade wine, and they wouldn't return until they had received a vision from the spirit world. Something in those words hooked into me and wouldn't let go. I didn't know the first thing about authentic spiritual traditions. I couldn't tell a Lakota ceremony from a Navajo one, but man, did I love the sound of that phrase, Vision Quest. 2 words that promised exactly what I was looking for: purpose, revelation, and transformation. Within weeks, I'd quit my job, sold my motorcycle, and packed whatever survival gear I could afford into an ancient external frame backpack. My parents thought I'd lost my mind. My friends threw me a going-away party where everyone got too stoned and forgot to ask when I'd be back. The truth was I had no timeline, no real plan, just a vague notion that I'd walk into the wild places and emerge somehow reborn. It might sound a little ridiculous now, this naive hippie appropriation of something sacred from cultures I knew very little or nothing about. But we all start our journeys from somewhere, and my starting point was equal parts ignorance and sincerity. I don't know if I ever expected to actually find a vision. I'm not sure if I knew what that was. And I certainly never expected that vision to have dog fangs. The first night alone in the woods hit me like a freight train of reality. My romantic notions of communing with nature dissolved into the practical terror of strange sounds and impenetrable darkness. I'd pitched my tent on what seemed like flat ground, only to discover I was on a subtle slope that had me sliding into the canvas by morning. Everything was damp. I was already homesick. My early weeks out there were a humbling education in my own incompetence. I brought too many books and not enough socks. My attempts at fishing yielded exactly 0 fish. My first campfire took nearly an hour to build and smoked so badly my eyes stung for days. I learned quickly that wilderness doesn't care about your intentions or your quest for meaning. It simply exists, indifferent to your survival. But something happens when you stick with discomfort long enough. By month 2, I'd established a rhythm that almost felt, natural. I'd wake with the sun, spend mornings gathering and fishing, finally successfully, Afternoons exploring or improving my makeshift homesteads, and evenings quietly watching the forest transform in the fading light. The constant relocation kept me from being detected by rangers or locals, though sometimes I'd catch glimpses of other hikers in the distance. Seasons became my calendar, weather my only schedule. Summer's lush abundance gave way to fall's spectacular decay. I learned to read the sky for coming storms, to identify which mushrooms would nourish, and which would send me into hallucinatory terror. I fashioned crude tools, patched my increasingly threadbare clothes, and developed calluses that felt like armor. The wilderness slowly rewrote my nervous system. Sounds that once startled me, the sudden crash of a falling branch, the midnight scream of a fox, became familiar languages that I could interpret without fear. Without much fear, anyway. My dreams grew vivid and strange, populated by creatures I'd observed during daylight hours. Sometimes I'd wake convinced that I'd been having conversations with deer or ravens. Loneliness, my constant companion during those first months, gradually transformed into something closer to solitude, a state I came to treasure. I would talk to myself. I would sing badly to the trees. I would recite poems half remembered from high school English. I created little rituals, morning gratitude to the spring that provided water, evening acknowledgement of the directions. Nothing authentic to any indigenous tradition, just intuitive practices that helped anchor me in a world without calendars or appointments. By winter, I barely recognized the soft-handed hippie who had stumbled into these woods. The man reflected in still pools had wild hair, weathered skin, and eyes that held a quiet watchfulness. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to thrive in a way I never had in civilization. And that was when the really strange stuff started happening. It happened during what people call the thunder moon, that full moon in July when summer heat builds toward afternoon storms that crash through the Pennsylvania highlands like celestial bowling balls. I'd pitched camp in a small clearing about 5 miles west of the Allegheny River, tucked into a forgotten pocket of old-growth forest that had somehow escaped the lumber company's saws. That place had an ancient feeling that both comforted and unsettled me, like I was being watched by something older than the trees themselves. That particular spot wasn't on any trail map. I discovered it while tracking a deer 3 days earlier, following game paths that twisted through dense rhododendron thickets until they suddenly opened into this perfect circle of flattened ground. A small spring bubbled up nearby, forming a crystalline pool before disappearing underground again. Massive oaks and hemlocks stood sentinel around the perimeter, their branches creating a natural cathedral ceiling that opened to a perfect circle of sky overhead. It felt somehow sacred, like I had stumbled onto nature's own temple. The night it happened, I'd been feeling particularly connected to my surroundings. The full moon illuminated the clearing with an almost theatrical brightness, casting everything in silvery blue light and ink-black shadow. The day's thunderstorm had passed, leaving the air electric with negative ions and the sweet smell of ozone. Crickets and frogs created nature's song while fireflies performed their silent light show at the forest's edge. I sat outside my tent, feeding small branches into my campfire, lost in that meditative trance that comes from watching the flames dance. That was when I felt it, a shift in the atmosphere. The crickets fell silent first, followed by the frogs. The fireflies continued their blinking oblivious, but something had definitely changed. The hairs on my arms stood at attention like tiny antennae searching for signals. My breath caught in my throat as primal instinct screamed one word to me: Predator. I slowly turned my head toward the northern edge of the clearing, where the darkness between the trees seemed to have coalesced into something denser than mere shadow. 2 pinpoints of amber light reflected the moonlight, eyes set higher off the ground than any normal forest creature's should be. As I stared, frozen, the shape detached itself from the tree line and moved into the clearing. I watched a dogman emerge into the moonlight, and my entire understanding of reality shattered like thin ice. It stood on 2 legs like a man, 7 feet tall at the minimum, probably closer to 8. But there was nothing human about its proportions or movements. Its legs bent backward at the knee like a canine's, ending in massive pawed feet that splayed out on the forest floor. Although bipedal, it moved with the fluid grace of a predator, muscles rippling beneath its coat with each calculated step. And what a coat it was! Not dog fur exactly, more like a dense pelt of guard hairs covering its entire body, primarily dark gray to black, with silver-tipped hair across its shoulders and its chest, creating an almost mane-like ruff. In the moonlight, this silver catching the glow created an ethereal outline around its massive upper body. The contrast made the creature seem both solid and spectral simultaneously. Its arms hung longer than any human's would, ending in hands that were neither fully paws nor fully fingers, something horrifyingly in between, with elongated digits tipped with curved black claws that looked capable of disemboweling a deer with a single swipe. Those hands twitched slightly as it stood regarding me, as if imagining the feel of tearing into my flesh. Those eyes, though, those were the most unnerving feature. Amber with vertical pupils like a cat's, they held an intelligence that was unmistakably conscious. This wasn't just an animal operating on instinct. Something was looking out from behind those eyes, calculating, assessing, knowing. Behind it swished a bushy tail, thick as my arm and nearly 3 feet long. Unlike a wolf's tail, which typically hangs down, this creature's tail extended out almost horizontally, the tip flicking slightly in a motion that reminded me disturbingly of a house cat about to pounce on a trapped mouse. The fur on the tail seemed coarser, almost bristle-like, with the same silver-tipped pattern that adorned its mane. When it breathed, its massive chest expanded, and I could see steam escaping its nostrils despite the July heat. It smelled like a wet dog. It smelled like decay, and also something metallic. Whatever this thing was, it had fed recently. It took 3 more steps into the clearing, the moonlight now fully illuminating its impossible form. Then, it stopped, raised its muzzle toward the moon, and made a sound I can only describe as a laugh wrapped inside a growl. A sound that conveyed cruel amusement and hungry intent in equal measure. I felt with absolute certainty that I was about to lose my life. However, in that moment of certain death, something ancient awakened inside me. It began as a tingling at the base of my spine. Not pain exactly, more like the fizzing of carbonation rushing through my nervous system. This sensation exploded upward, branching through my vertebrae like lightning seeking the path of least resistance. My vision blurred and then sharpened, the moonlit clearing suddenly saturated with details I'd never noticed before. I could suddenly see individual dewdrops trembling on grass blades, the subtle variations in the dogman's fur as it shifted in the breeze. I felt I could suddenly see microscopic insects crawling across fallen leaves. My hearing transformed next. The silence of the forest wasn't silence at all, but a song combining subtle sounds. The dogman's breathing, the distant rustling of a field mouse 40 yards away, the whisper of bat wings overhead, the very sap moving through the trees around me. These sounds did not overwhelm. Instead, they arranged themselves into perfect order, each one precisely located in 3-dimensional space around me. The tingling reached my scalp, and that's when the real pain started. Not the dull, throbbing kind that comes with injury, but the exquisite, clarifying agony of rapid cellular change. My skull began to reshape itself, my face pushing forward as my jaw dislocated with a series of wet pops. Teeth, elongated, sharpening to points that cut my tongue as they grew. I heard myself make a sound no human throat should produce. Half growl and half howl. The dogman took a startled step back. My fingers cramped severely, bones cracking as they lengthened, joints reconfiguring. My nails thickened and darkened, turning into claws that dug into the earth beneath me. The pain should have been unbearable, but it rode alongside a wave of euphoria that made every sensation, even agony, feel like ecstatic revelation. My clothes became unbearably constraining, the fabric rough against skin that had become hypersensitive. I wasn't thinking in words anymore, but pure sensation and instinct. Something told me to stand, and I did, rising to a height that matched the creature before me. My spine realigned with audible clicks, my posture changing from the hunched stance of modern man to something more primal and powerful, balanced perfectly between human verticality and quadrupedal readiness. The hair came next, sprouting from every pore in a rush that felt like thousands of needles pushing outward simultaneously. Coarse, dense hair, covering my transformed body in a protective layer that seemed to capture the moonlight, giving me a silvery aura. I could feel a heavy mane forming around my neck and my shoulders. Most miraculous of all were the changes to my consciousness. My human mind didn't disappear, but expanded, incorporating new instincts and awarenesses that felt at once foreign and fundamentally familiar, as though I were remembering rather than becoming. My thoughts became less verbal and more sensory, organized more around immediate perception than abstract concepts. Time itself seemed to slow, each second stretching to accommodate the overwhelming influx of information from my heightened senses. The scent dimension opened up like a hidden universe. I could smell everything, the lingering ozone from the earlier storm, the distinct musk of the Dogman, traces of every animal that had passed through the clearing in the past 3 days, the chemical composition of the soil, my own human scent, rapidly changing into something wild and pungent. Smells weren't just identifiable, but emotionally charged, carrying information about intention, health, fear, and aggression. Possibly most unsettling was my new relationship with hunger. It arose in me like a separate entity, a ravening presence with desires of its own. I could sense the blood flowing through the Dogman's veins. I could almost taste it on my own tongue, rich with power that I could absorb through consumption. That thought should have horrified me, but in my transformed state, it felt like the most natural impulse in the world. By the time the transformation completed, I was occupying a different reality than the one I had known my entire life. Colors had shifted, blues and greens fading, while reds intensified. The moon above seemed to pulse with significance, its light not merely illuminating the clearing, but charging everything with subtle energy that my new form could somehow detect. The trees around us were not inanimate, but colonies of life, engaged in slow, deliberate communication. And the Dogman, I saw him differently now. Not as a monster, but as a rival predator in my territory. I recognized aspects of his body language invisible to human perception. The slight backward tilt of his ears indicating surprise, the tension in his haunches suggesting preparation for either attack or retreat. The almost imperceptible dilation of his nostrils as he processed my new scent. What shocked me most was his absence of fear. In its place was a wild exhilaration, a sense of rightness and completion. For the first time in my life, I felt fully embodied, fully present, fully alive. The dichotomy between my mind and body that defines the human condition had dissolved into perfect integration. Every cell hummed with purpose and power. I opened my transformed mouth and tasted the night air with a tongue no longer meant for human speech. When I exhaled, it emerged as a rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very molecules between us. The sound carried a clear message requiring no translation. This place is mine. Challenge me at your own risk. The territorial standoff had begun, and deep in whatever remained of my human consciousness I knew, only one of us would walk away from this encounter. I woke with the dawn, naked and shivering despite the July heat. My clothes lay in tatters around me, as though they'd been burst from within. Deep furrows marked the earth where claws had torn into the soil. The Dogman was not around. He had left behind only scattered tufts of dark fur and massive paw prints leading north into the forest. My body ached in ways I couldn't comprehend. Muscles sore in places I didn't even know I had muscles. When I dragged myself to the spring and caught my reflection, I barely recognized the wild-eyed man staring back. No physical evidence of transformation remained, yet I felt fundamentally altered, as though my cells carried the memory of being something else entirely. For weeks afterward, I tried to trigger another change. Under subsequent full moons, I'd sit in clearings, willing my body to shift, sometimes howling pathetically like some wannabe lycanthrope. Nothing happened. Whatever doorway had opened that first night had firmly closed behind itself. I completed my vision quest year, but the experience haunted every moment. Had I actually transformed? Or had extreme terror simply convinced me that I had? Had I hallucinated the entire encounter? But if so, what explained the destruction around my campsite? The strange wounds that healed with supernatural speed. The way animals now gave me a wide berth wherever I went. That was nearly 50 years ago. I've lived what most would call a normal life since then. Marriage, career, mortgage, grandkids. I never returned to those specific woods. Some doors are better left shut. Yet on certain nights, when the moon hangs full and heavy, something sits inside me. A restlessness that sends me pacing. A heightened awareness that makes the human world seem flat and colorless compared to what I once experienced. Sometimes I catch my reflection in a window, and for a split second, I swear I see something else looking back. Something with amber eyes and a knowing gaze. Maybe my transformation was purely psychological. A moment when my terrified mind accessed some primal aggressive part of itself that could stand its ground against a predator. Maybe we all carry these ancient defenses within us, hidden beneath layers of civilization. Or maybe, just maybe, there are thin places in the world where reality bends, where the boundaries between human and animal blur, and where magic, for lack of a better word, still exists. I don't know what really happened that night, but I know this. I went seeking a vision quest and I found something that forever changed me. Just not in any way that I could have possibly imagined.
No whys or whats, because or ifs, tonight's show is brought to you by Sabrina Midkiff. Please join me in thanking channel member Sabrina Midkiff for making this episode possible. As a channel member, she gets to see our weekly secret uncensored episodes. For more information about how you can help this channel stay online like the wonderful Sabrina Midkiff, here's our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank?
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.